I signed the contract on a gray composite desk that had seen better decades, the surface scratched and pitted from years of other desperate people making similar decisions. The office had no windows, just four beige walls, fluorescent panels humming overhead, and a ventilation grate that wheezed recycled air smelling of carpet cleaner and someone's lunch from 3 hours ago. Gabriel Griffith slid the paperwork across to me, already rotated the right direction. Professional courtesy. The pen he offered was warm from his pocket. I tried not to stare at the figure on page 3, but my eyes kept drifting back. $400,000. Written out in words and numbers both, like the repetition might make it more real. 6 months of work. Cable maintenance near the Mariana Trench. The math played itself out without my permission. $66,000 per month. $15,000 per week. More than I'd made in the past 18 months combined. My hand steadied as I signed. Frederick Griffin in 3 places, initialed twice more on the addendums. The pen scratched against the paper, loud in the small room. Gabriel smiled and stood extending his hand. "Welcome to Deep Link Communications." I shook it. His grip was soft, palm slightly damp, desk workers' hands. Mine were calloused from the 6 weeks I'd spent doing construction before my back gave out, then smooth again from the unemployment that followed. "You won't regret this," he said. I nodded because that's what you do when someone says something like that. The contract sat between us, my signature still wet on the bottom line. 400,000 reasons not to regret anything. Gabriel settled back into his chair and opened a thin folder, though he barely glanced at it. He'd given this speech before. Many times, I figured, given how smooth it came out. "The work itself is straightforward," he said. "Routine inspections of fiber optic lines along the Pacific floor, data traffic, international communications, financial transactions, streaming services. Millions of terabytes passing through those cables every hour." I listened, watched his face, his hands. He had a tell when he hit certain phrases, the smallest pause before words like routine and straightforward. Not quite hesitation. More like someone stepping carefully across stones they'd crossed 100 times before. "You'll be stationed on the Constant Depth, one of our dedicated maintenance vessels. She's equipped with everything you'll need. Remote diagnostics, repair drones, full machine shop for cable work." He tapped the folder. "Your background in telecommunications makes you ideal for this. Most of the inspection work is reading sensor data, identifying anomalies before they become failures." "What kind of anomalies?" I asked. "Stress fractures in the sheathing, pressure degradation. Occasionally some sea life gets curious and causes abrasion damage." He smiled. "Nothing you can't handle with the equipment we provide." The fluorescent panels hummed. One of them flickered, just barely. The kind of malfunction you only notice when you've spent too much time in small rooms waiting for good news that doesn't come. "The depth is significant, of course," Gabriel continued. "The cables run through some of the deepest sections of the Pacific. But you'll be working remotely. The Constant Depth maintains position on the surface, and all repairs are conducted via submersible drones. You'll never be in the water yourself." That last part sounded rehearsed, emphasized just a fraction too much. I nodded anyway. "What's the crew size?" "Varies between 12 and 15. Captain Brooklyn Santos runs a tight operation. Professional team." He closed the folder. "You'll receive full training during the transit to the work site. 2 weeks to get familiar with the systems before your contract period officially begins." 2 weeks unpaid, but I'd expected that. Training never counts toward the contract hours. I'd seen the job listing 4 times in 6 months. Same position, same pay, same vague description about cable maintenance in the Pacific. That kind of repetition meant something. "What's the turnover rate?" I asked. Gabriel's smile thinned. "Not gone, just reduced to its essential components." Professional politeness with nothing behind it. "I appreciate the direct question," he said, which meant he'd been asked before and had an answer ready. "We have experienced some retention challenges with this particular position." He pulled out a different folder, thinner than the first. "The isolation can be difficult," he said. 6 months on a vessel with limited communication, no port calls, nothing but ocean in every direction. It's not for everyone." "How many people have quit?" "The psychological demands of deep-sea work are substantial." He opened the folder, glanced at whatever was inside, closed it again. "We've learned to be upfront about that during the hiring process. Some candidates complete their training and realize they're not suited for the environment." I waited. Silence makes people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people fill the space with truth they didn't plan to share. Gabriel shifted in his chair. "In the past 2 years, we've hired 7 technicians for this position. None of them completed their full contracts." 7. The number sat heavy in the small room. Why not? Each had their own reasons. He spread his hands, a gesture of openness that revealed nothing. 1 cited family emergency. 2 left for mental health reasons, the isolation I mentioned. The others, he paused, they chose not to specify. "They just quit?" "Contract termination before completion, yes." He tapped the folder. "It's outlined in your paperwork. Voluntary separation before the 6-month mark forfeits the completion bonus." I'd read that section. Read it 3 times, actually. The completion bonus was worth $180,000, nearly half the total pay. 7 people walked away from that much money. The human mind responds unpredictably to prolonged isolation and pressure. Gabriel's voice stayed level, practiced. "We've enhanced our psychological screening since then. Added support resources, improved the communication protocols with shore facilities. We believe we've addressed the core issues." Which meant they hadn't identified the core issues, just guessed and made changes that looked good in a policy document. The fluorescent panel flickered again. I counted 3 seconds before it steadied. "We're confident you'll find the work manageable," Gabriel said. "Your technical background, your experience with remote diagnostics, He glanced at something in my file. "Your current circumstances suggest someone with the focus and motivation to see this through." Current circumstances. Polite way of saying broke and desperate. He wasn't wrong. I needed the money. That's what it came down to. Sitting in that windowless office with recycled air and humming lights, and a contract promising more money than I'd make in 5 years of normal work. My landlord had already filed the eviction paperwork. 30 days to vacate, and I had maybe $400 to my name. Couldn't make rent, couldn't afford the deposit on a cheaper place, couldn't keep living in my car through a Seattle winter. $400,000. 7 people had quit. 7 people had walked away from money that could change everything. I thought about that. Tried to imagine what would make someone forfeit $180,000. What kind of isolation? What kind of pressure? What kind of work environment would be worse than going home broke with nothing to show for it? Couldn't picture it. Maybe that was inexperience. Maybe that was desperation narrowing my vision to the only number that mattered. Gabriel waited. Patient. He'd seen this calculation before, watched other people do the same math in the same chair. The warning signs were clear. Absurdly high pay for routine maintenance work. 7 consecutive failures. Vague explanations about isolation and psychological demands. The careful way Gabriel stepped around certain details. The practiced smoothness of his reassurances. I knew better. I'd always been observant, good at spotting the patterns other people missed. That's what made me decent at technical work, seeing the small inconsistencies that signaled bigger problems. I saw the inconsistencies here. Didn't matter. I needed $400,000 more than I needed to listen to the part of my brain raising red flags. When do I start? I asked. Gabriel smiled. Real warmth this time, or a convincing simulation. The constant depth leaves from San Diego in 4 days. We'll arrange your travel and lodging until departure. He extended his hand again. I shook it. The contract sat between us, signed and binding. My signature in 3 places. My decision, made with open eyes and ignored warnings. I needed the money badly enough to pretend I didn't know better. The company flew me out to San Diego on a Tuesday. By Wednesday afternoon, I stood on the deck of the Constant Depth with my duffel at my feet and the Pacific stretching flat and gray in every direction. Captain Brooklyn Santos met me at the gangway. 5'8", military bearing, short black hair cut to regulation length I didn't know but recognized from guys who'd served. She shook my hand once, firm grip, no wasted motion. Griffin, welcome aboard. Stow your gear in cabin 12, galleys forward, briefing at 0600 tomorrow. She turned and walked toward the bridge before I could respond. Naval terminology, clipped cadence. I'd worked construction sites with foremen who talked that way. Everything in order, nothing requiring confirmation. The vessel itself ran about 200 feet, painted white with rust stains bleeding from the deck fixtures. Research equipment clustered near the stern, crane assemblies, winch housings, a deployment platform I'd learned to navigate later. Crew moved around me with practiced efficiency. Nobody making eye contact. Everyone focused on pre-departure tasks I didn't understand yet. I found cabin 12. Narrow bunk, storage locker, porthole showing more gray water. Unpacked in 3 minutes. Sat on the bunk and felt the slight rock of the vessel beneath me. Heard metal creaking somewhere in the bulkhead. I went topside and watched San Diego disappear behind us. The submersible sat in its deployment cradle near the stern, designated Mantis 7 according to the stenciled lettering across the hull. Looked less impressive than I'd imagined. Basically a reinforced sphere with mechanical arms bolted to the front and thruster assemblies clustered around the chassis. Dull yellow paint, scratched and worn from repeated deployment. Small viewport showing the pilot seat and control panel inside. Peter Baldwin found me staring at it the second day out. 29, slight build, glasses with rectangular frames. Technical crew jumpsuit with an equipment belt carrying tools I couldn't identify yet. Your ride, he said, gestured toward Mantis 7. Rated to 25,000 feet, titanium pressure hull, LED flood array, articulated manipulators for cable work. Holds position pretty well once you're down there, even with current. I nodded. Tried to picture sitting inside that sphere with 5 miles of water overhead. Extended maintenance windows, Peter continued. You can stay down 8-10 hours if needed. Life support's solid. Heating system mostly works. Mostly. I filed that away. Captain wants me to walk you through orientation today. Database access, previous logs, standard procedures. He pushed his glasses up. Figured we'd start with the records. Give you context before your first dive. The operations room sat below deck. Fluorescent lighting and workstations arranged in a horseshoe configuration. Monitors displayed readouts I'd need weeks to fully understand. Peter led me to a terminal near the back and logged in with credentials he'd written on a scrap of paper. Maintenance database, he said. typed commands that brought up a file directory. Every technician logs their work: cable inspections, repair notes, equipment status, environmental observations. Company policy requires daily entries. The screen showed folders organized by technician name and date range, 7 names total. Maria Barton at the top of the list. Peter clicked her folder open. First contractor, started about 2 years ago. Lasted 4 months before she termed out early. I scanned the entries. Professional formatting, technical language, precise timestamps. Barton had documented cable conditions at specific coordinates, sediment accumulation rates, sheathing integrity percentages. One entry detailed barnacle growth on junction housings at depth. Another measured water temperature variations across a 3-mile cable section. Standard work. Exactly what Gabriel had described in that office with the flickering fluorescent panel. She knew what she was doing, I said. Peter nodded. All of them did. Company doesn't hire amateurs for this. He scrolled down through more entries. Same professional tone throughout, same attention to detail. She filed clean reports right up until she requested contract termination. Family emergency, supposedly. I caught the word choice. Supposedly. You don't think it was family? Peter's hand hovered over the mouse. I think people leave for their own reasons. Not my place to speculate. He closed Barton's folder and opened the next. Second technician lasted 6 weeks. Didn't leave much documentation worth reviewing. Another folder. Third one's more interesting. Noah Gordon, 41 years old according to the personnel header. Started his contract 16 months ago. The early entries matched Barton's professional style. Cable condition assessments, equipment performance logs, routine observations about seafloor topology. But Peter scrolled down to entries from Gordon's second month, and I saw the tone shift. Sediment disturbance noted at 3,400 feet during cable inspection. Pattern suggests movement through area within previous 12 to 24 hours. No equipment deployment logged in this sector. Next entry, 3 days later. Floodlights illuminating approximately 40-foot radius at depth. Observed shadows at edge of visible zone during maintenance work. Unable to identify source. Water clarity normal for depth. I leaned closer to the screen. Shadows? Could be anything down there, Peter said. Quiet voice, not quite meeting my eyes. Fish, debris, current patterns creating visual artifacts. Limited visibility makes observation difficult. But he'd scrolled directly to these entries. Knew exactly where to find them. I read more. Gordon's later logs mentioned the shadows repeatedly, appearing at the edge of the floodlight radius, then gone when he adjusted the illumination angle. Movement that didn't match current flow. He documented timestamps, coordinates, equipment settings, trying to establish pattern or explanation. His final entries stopped mentioning them entirely. Returned to standard cable documentation, professional and sterile, nothing unusual reported. He finished his observations and moved on, I said. He termed out at month 3, Peter corrected. Mental health reasons, officially. The operations room hummed around us. Ventilation system, computer cooling fans, something mechanical running through the bulkhead behind the workstations. Peter opened the 5th technician's folder without comment. Felix Parsons. 35, analytical writing style, scientific precision in his documentation. I read through entries detailing water displacement patterns Parsons had measured using the submersible's sonar array. Large-scale movement below the visible zone, he'd written. Displacement volume suggesting mass transit through sectors adjacent to maintenance areas. He'd calculated approximate sizes based on pressure wave propagation. The numbers didn't mean much to me yet, but Parsons had included comparison notes. Displacement patterns inconsistent with known whale species in depth range. Movement velocity exceeds typical migration speeds. What did he think it was? I asked. Peter shrugged. Slight gesture, non-committal. He didn't speculate in the logs, just recorded data. He closed the folder. He lasted 2 months before he termed out. No official reason given. 2 months. Same as Gordon. Peter's hand moved to the final folder. 7th technician, Kelsey Oliver. She started 4 months ago, Peter said. Lasted 10 days. He opened the folder. Single entry inside, dated from her 2nd day aboard. I read it twice. Initial descent completed. Cable inspection protocol standard. Equipment functional. Observed approach pattern consistent with previous technician reports. Adjusting work schedule appears to trigger response adjustment. Something now knows the schedule. That was it. Entire documentation from 10 days of contract work. She left the next morning, Peter said. Requested immediate helicopter extraction, paid her own transport costs back to shore. Wouldn't talk to anyone about what she'd seen. Captain tried to debrief her. Company rep called twice. She just kept saying she was done. I stared at the single entry on the screen. 10 days. Whatever she'd figured out, she'd figured it fast. Something now knows the schedule. Peter closed the folder. The screen returned to the directory listing. 7 names. 7 incomplete contracts. 7 people who'd sat in Mantis 7 and descended to the same coordinates I'd be visiting starting tomorrow. Why'd you show me this? I asked. He took off his glasses, cleaned them on his jumpsuit, slow methodical movements, put them back on and finally looked at me directly. Company policy says I'm supposed to walk new technicians through previous documentation, standard orientation procedure. His voice stayed quiet, measured. You asked to see the logs. I showed you the logs, but he'd scrolled directly to specific entries, Gordon's shadows, Parsons's displacement patterns, Oliver's final observation. I thought about Gabriel's office, that thin folder, 7 prior technicians who hadn't completed their contracts, family emergencies, mental health, personal reasons. None of it explaining the pattern in these entries. Professional documentation slowly noting anomalies, then either stopping abruptly or reverting to sterile reports before termination. What do you think is down there? I asked. Peter stood, logged out of the terminal, the screen going dark. I think the cables need maintenance and the work pays well and people leave jobs for all kinds of reasons. He headed toward the operations room door, then paused. First dive's 0600 tomorrow. Captain'll want you rested. He left me sitting at the dark terminal, the database closed, 7 folders of documentation filed away in whatever server ran beneath the constant depths deck plating. I sat there another 10 minutes, listened to the ventilation system, the mechanical hum, the distant sound of waves against the hull. Something now knows the schedule. I stood up and went to find my cabin. Tomorrow I'd descend for the first time, and whatever was waiting down there in the dark, I'd deal with it when the floodlights showed me what 7 other technicians had already seen. I sat in that operations room and told myself those logs didn't mean anything. Isolation does things to people. Stick someone in a tin can at the bottom of the ocean for months at a time, and their brain starts filling in the blanks. Makes patterns where there aren't any. Sees movement in static shadows. That's what I figured happened to Gordon and Parsons and Oliver. Kelsey especially. 10 days, and she was gone. That wasn't observation. That was panic. Someone who couldn't handle the pressure, literal and otherwise, and invented reasons to justify quitting. The brain's good at that. Finds threats that aren't there. Builds narratives that let you run without admitting you're scared. $400,000 bought a lot of rationalization. I went back to cabin 12 and lay on the bunk, feeling the vessel roll beneath me. The porthole showed black water now. No lights from shore anymore. Just Pacific darkness and the occasional white cap catching moonlight. Metal creaked somewhere in the bulkhead. Steady rhythm, almost like breathing. I thought about the shadows Gordon mentioned, the displacement Parsons measured, Kelsey's approach pattern that adjusted when the work schedule changed. Then I thought about my landlord's eviction notice. 30 days. The 400 and change in my account. Winter coming and nowhere to go. I slept fine. The first 2 weeks went exactly how Gabriel described them. Routine inspections, standard diagnostic checks, tedious, straightforward work that didn't require much beyond basic attention and a tolerance for tight spaces. The descent took 40 minutes each time. I'd strap into Mantis 7's pilot seat at dawn, run through the pre-dive checklist Peter gave me, and signal topside when I was ready. The crane would lift the submersible off its cradle, swing it over the stern, and lower it into the water. First, there'd be sunlight filtering through the viewport, turning everything blue-green and wavering. Then darker blue as I sank. Then blue-black. Then nothing but the floodlights. The cable ran along the seafloor at coordinates, the navigation system displayed in the upper right corner of my console. Fiber optic trunk line, 3 inches in diameter. Armored sheathing designed to handle the pressure and temperature and occasional tectonic shift. Junction housings every half-mile where subsidiary lines branched off. My job was to pilot Mantis 7 along the route, inspect each junction, run diagnostic readings through the sensor array, and note any degradation in the logs. Most days I found nothing worth mentioning. Sediment accumulation, standard. Minor barnacle growth on the housing seals, expected. Temperature readings within normal parameters. Sheathing integrity at 97, 98%. I'd record the numbers, move to the next junction, repeat the process. At 23,000 feet, the pressure hull creaked sometimes. Not alarming, just the titanium adjusting. The heating system worked well enough, though my breath fogged the viewport if I leaned too close. The mechanical arms responded cleanly when I tested them, and the thrusters held position even when the current picked up. 8 hours down there each dive. I'd work through the junction points methodically, eat the protein bar I brought, drink water from the reservoir tube clipped near my shoulder. The radio crackled occasionally with Peter's voice doing status checks. I'd confirm position, report findings, continue the route. It was boring work. Exactly the kind of boring I needed. No shadows at the edge of the lights. No displacement readings. No approach patterns. Just cable, seafloor, and the steady hum of Mantis 7 systems keeping me alive at the bottom of the ocean. I started thinking maybe the previous technicians had cracked for simpler reasons. Maybe the isolation got to them before they ever saw anything real. Maybe Gordon's shadows were floaters in his vision, and Parsons misread his instruments, and Kelsey spooked herself reading their logs before her first dive. Maybe I'd actually finish this contract. 3rd week started the same. Monday morning I descended to the first junction point, ran diagnostics, recorded the readings. Moved to the 2nd junction. Then the 3rd. I was at 19,000 feet, approaching junction 7, when I saw the movement. Peripheral vision, left side. Something shifted at the very edge where the floodlights faded into the black. I turned my head. Nothing there. Just darkness and a few particles of sediment drifting through the light cone. Eye strain, I figured. I'd been staring at the console displays for 3 hours straight, then looking out into the void. Pupils adjusting, retinas tired, brain filling in motion where there wasn't any. I completed the inspection at Junction 7, moved on to Junction 8. Same thing. Movement on the right this time, at the border between light and dark. Peripheral again. gone when I looked directly at it. I blinked hard a few times, rubbed my eyes, checked the viewport for smudges or scratches that might create illusions. Surface was clean. Finished junction 8, continued to junction 9. There it was again. Left side. Definite movement, almost a gliding motion, tracking parallel to Mantis 7's course before disappearing into the black. My hands stayed steady on the controls. Heart rate picked up maybe 10 beats per minute. Nothing serious. I ran the diagnostics at junction 9, recorded the readings, moved on. Junction 10. Movement again. Right side this time. I checked the sonar display. Nothing registering beyond the standard background scatter. Water temperature steady. No unusual displacement readings. But something was moving out there. Tuesday's dive. Same depth, same route. Movement appeared at 19,000 feet during my approach to junction 6. Peripheral vision, left side, gone when I turned toward it. Wednesday. Movement at 19,000 feet near junction 7. Right side. Thursday. Left side again, then right side 15 minutes later. Friday I started paying attention to the pattern. Noted the exact depth reading when I first saw movement. 19,040 feet. Checked the floodlight effective radius, approximately 60 feet, before the intensity faded below useful visibility. Whatever was moving stayed just beyond that threshold, right at the edge, where shadow became absolute. I didn't mention it in my logs. Wrote up the junction diagnostics, same as always. Sediment, temperature, integrity percentages, professional documentation that wouldn't raise questions. But I started testing variables. Monday of the 4th week, I altered my descent speed. Came down slower, watching the depth gauge. At 19,000 feet, I cut the thrusters and let Mantis 7 drift, minimizing my own movement. Took 3 minutes. Then I saw it. Peripheral vision, tracking left to right across my field of view, staying precisely at the light's edge. I rotated the submersible 30 degrees. The movement adjusted. Stayed at the boundary. Tuesday I changed my route approach. Came at junction 6 from the north instead of the west. Different angle, different orientation. Didn't matter. At 19,000 feet the movement appeared. Same position relative to the lights. Same gliding motion at the periphery. Wednesday I ran the floodlights at full intensity, pushing the effective radius out maybe another 10 feet. The movement stayed beyond it, adjusted its distance to match the new threshold. Thursday I dimmed the floods to 70%. The movement came closer, maintained its position at the new light boundary. Friday I sat in Mantis 7 at 19,000 feet and accepted what the previous technicians already knew. Something was down here, something that tracked the submersible with mechanical precision, maintaining exact distance at the edge of visibility. Something that adjusted its behavior based on the lights, the approach angle, the route timing. Something that had been present at this depth threshold every single time I descended for the past 2 weeks. And I was only on week 3. The sediment bothered me more than the shadows. I'd worked 3 weeks by then, enough time to understand how the ocean floor behaved at 20,000 feet. The silt down there settled into patterns, natural accumulations around the cable housings, undisturbed expanses between them, and the occasional disruption when Mantis 7's thrusters kicked sediment into temporary clouds that drifted and resettled within minutes. Predictable. Mechanical cause, visible effect. What I observed on my 4th week didn't match that pattern. I'd positioned Mantis 7 beside junction housing 47, running the standard diagnostic sequence. The sensor array needed 30 seconds to complete its readings, so I sat still in the pilot seat, thrusters at minimal output to maintain position. The viewport showed the usual scene. Armored cable disappearing into darkness on both sides. The junction housing's metal surface covered in the thin layer of sediment that accumulated everywhere down here, and the seafloor stretching flat and featureless beyond the floodlight radius. The sediment moved. Not near me. Out there, maybe 60 feet from Mantis 7's position, right at the edge where the floodlights faded to black, a wave rolled through the silt, displacement running perpendicular to my position. I watched the sediment rise in a low ridge, travel left to right across my field of vision, then settle. My hands stayed on the controls, didn't move. The diagnostic array kept running its sequence, numbers scrolling across the left monitor. Another wave. Same distance. Same pattern. This one traveled right to left. I checked the thruster output. Minimal. Nowhere near enough force to disturb sediment 60 feet away, and the pattern was wrong anyway. Thruster wash created radial dispersal, clouds that spread outward from the source. These were linear displacements, waves that suggested something large moving parallel to my position. The diagnostic completed. I should have logged the readings and moved to the next junction. I sat there instead watching the sediment. Third wave, left to right again. The ridge rose higher this time, maybe 4 inches of displaced silt traveling in a smooth arc that maintained consistent distance from Mantis 7. I tried to calculate the force required to create that displacement. Something moving through water, pushing current ahead of it, that current reaching the seafloor and disturbing the settled sediment. Something big. My mouth went dry. I reached for the water bottle I'd strapped to the console, took a drink. The water tasted stale, metallic from the bottle's lining. Fourth wave, right to left. Closer this time, maybe 50 feet from my position. The displacement ridge rose 6 inches, traveled faster than the previous waves. I switched on the external camera array. Mantis 7 carried 4 cameras, forward-facing mounted above the viewport, aft-facing on the thruster assembly, and 2 lateral cameras covering the port and starboard approaches. The monitors displaying their feeds sat in a row across the top of the console. I'd barely looked at them before. The forward view duplicated what I could see through the viewport, and the other angles showed nothing but darkness and occasional sediment clouds. I looked now. The aft camera showed the cable receding into blackness behind me. The lateral cameras showed the same empty seafloor visible through the viewport. Nothing moved in any of the frames. Fifth wave, left to right. 40 feet out. The sediment rose almost 8 inches this time, the ridge casting a visible shadow in the floodlight's angled illumination. I counted the intervals. 23 seconds between waves. Consistent timing. Alternating directions. Decreasing radius. A pattern. My hands tightened on the controls. I could surface. Run the ascent sequence, signal topside, get Mantis 7 back to the constant depth, and tell Captain Santos I'd observed unusual water movement. She'd ask what I meant by unusual. I'd describe the sediment displacement. She'd ask if I'd seen anything that caused it. I hadn't. Just waves in the silt. Could be currents. Could be thermal variations. Could be a dozen things that had nothing to do with the shadows Gordon reported, or the displacement Parsons measured, or the approach pattern that made Kelsey quit after 10 days. Could be. I stayed in position and watched the sediment for another 12 minutes. The waves continued. 23-second intervals, alternating directions, the radius tightening with each pass. By the time I logged the diagnostic readings and moved to the next junction, the displacement waves were rolling through silt 30 feet from Mantis 7's hull. Something was circling me, staying just beyond the light, matching my position as I moved along the cable route. I knew it. Couldn't prove it. Couldn't see it. Couldn't record anything but sediment movement that any competent engineer would attribute to current patterns or equipment wash. But I knew. I found Janice in the communications room after I'd surfaced and completed the post-dive checklist. She sat at her workstation, headset around her neck, 3 monitors displaying data streams I didn't recognize. She looked up when I knocked on the doorframe. "Need something?" "Camera footage," I said, "from today's dive. External array." Her expression didn't change, but her hand stopped moving on the keyboard. "What for?" "Review. Want to check something I observed on the seafloor." She turned back to her monitors, didn't say anything. I stepped into the room. "The system archives the feeds, right? All 4 cameras, full dive duration." "Yeah." Her voice stayed flat. Professional. "Archives automatically. Can you transfer today's files to my cabin terminal?" She clicked through several screens without responding. Her fingers moved slower than they should have, deliberate pauses between commands. "Janice. I heard you." She opened a new window, typed a command string. "Which dive?" "You ran 2 today." "Second one, 1600 hours departure." More clicking. She pulled up a directory listing, scrolled through the files. Her jaw tightened. "Problem?" I asked. "No." She highlighted 4 files, the camera feeds from the 4 external arrays. Her hand hovered over the transfer command. "You sure you want these?" Strange question. "Yeah. Why wouldn't I?" She looked at me then. Direct eye contact. Held it for 3 seconds. Something moved behind her expression. Not quite fear, not quite warning. Something between them. Then she transferred the files. Her fingers hit the keys hard enough I heard the clicks across the room. "Sent to your terminal. Cabin 12. "Thanks." "Sure." She turned back to her screens, put her headset back on. Conversation over. I stood there another moment, waiting for her to add something. Explanation for the hesitation, comment about the footage, anything. She said nothing. Just adjusted her headset and started typing again, eyes fixed on her monitors. I left the communications room and headed for cabin 12. The recordings were waiting. I sat at the desk. Chair creaked under my weight. My hands were steady when I woke the terminal, typed my credentials, navigated to the directory where external camera archives lived. 4 files per dive. 2 dives today. 8 files total, each labeled with timestamp and camera designation. Forward, aft, port, starboard. Started with today's 2nd dive. 1600 hours departure. The one where I'd watched sediment waves circle closer. Forward camera file opened in the media player. Timestamp in the corner, 16:03:47. 3 minutes into descent. Viewport showed blue-green water darkening as Mantis 7 dropped, particulate matter drifting past the lens, floodlights cutting a cone of visibility that shrank as depth increased. I watched the descent. Watched the water turn from blue-green to darker blue to blue-black. Watched the seafloor come into frame at 16 minutes 50 seconds. Nothing unusual. Cable visible. Junction housing ahead. Sediment undisturbed. I dragged the progress bar forward. Jumped to the section where I'd logged the disturbance. 1742. Mantis 7 positioned beside junction housing 47. Diagnostic array running. Viewport showed the housing, the cable disappearing into darkness on both sides. Then the first sediment wave rolled through the lower left quadrant of the frame. Low ridge, left to right, approximately 60 feet out. I stopped the playback, backed it up 10 seconds, watched again. The sediment didn't move until 1742:18. Before that, nothing. Flat seafloor. Then the wave. I switched to the port camera feed, same timestamp. Angle showed the left side of Mantis 7, thruster assembly visible in the lower corner, seafloor extending into darkness beyond the floodlight radius. At 17:42:18, something moved at the edge of the frame. Not sediment, not a current disturbance. A shape. Massive. Dark gray, almost black. Textured surface that didn't reflect light the way metal or rock would. Organic. It passed through the far edge of visibility, 60 feet out, moving right to left. I could see maybe a third of it, just the leading edge as it crossed the camera's field of view. The rest extended beyond the light. My mouth went dry. I reached for the water bottle I'd left on the desk that morning. Empty. I'd forgotten. I let the footage play. 23 seconds later, the shape passed again, this time left to right. Closer. 50 feet. The texture resolved slightly, not smooth. Irregular surface, mottled. Something that looked like scarring or growth patterns. It circled 6 more times in the footage. Each pass brought it closer. By the final wave I'd logged before moving to the next junction, the thing was 30 feet from Mantis 7's hull. The port camera caught it clearly for 2 seconds. A curved surface that filled half the frame, moving with deliberate slowness, trailing sediment in its wake. Then I'd piloted away to the next junction, and the shape didn't follow. It stayed behind, just outside the range where the aft camera could resolve detail. I closed the file, sat back. The chair creaked again. That was one dive, one 40-minute window on the seafloor. I opened the files from this morning's dive. First descent of the day. 0600 departure. Started with the port camera again. Jumped to 17 minutes in, roughly when I'd have reached the seafloor. The shape was already there. It rose into frame from below at 06:17:04, ascending from deeper water like it had been waiting. Positioned itself 60 feet from Mantis 7 and held station. I watched myself complete the first 3 junction inspections. The shape followed, maintaining distance, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. 17 minutes into descent. Every time. I backed out of today's files. Opened yesterday's. Same thing. Shape appeared at 17 minutes, circled during inspections, maintained position just beyond floodlight range. Day before that. Same. I started pulling files from a week ago. 2 weeks. 3. My hands weren't steady anymore. Fingers slipped on the keyboard twice. I had to retype commands. 3 weeks back. 4 camera feeds per dive, 2 dives per day. I spot-checked, jumping to the 17-minute mark in each port camera file. Every single dive. Every one. The thing rose from deeper water at 17 minutes and positioned itself near Mantis 7. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but always there, always watching. I went back further, pulled files from my first week on the job, the dives I'd thought were routine, the inspections I'd logged as standard sediment accumulation and normal parameters. First dive ever. 4 weeks ago. Port camera footage at 17 minutes 12 seconds. The shape rose into frame from below, enormous and dark, and settled into position 70 feet from Mantis 7. It stayed there for the entire dive. When I'd surfaced, it had descended back into the trench. I'd been piloting Mantis 7 with that thing circling me for a month, and I hadn't known. Hadn't seen it through the viewport because it stayed just beyond the floodlights. Hadn't checked the camera feeds because everything had seemed routine. My stomach turned. I pushed back from the desk, stood, paced the 3 steps to the porthole and back. The cabin felt smaller, walls too close. I sat back down, pulled up the earliest files in the archive, before my contract started. Last technician, Kelsey Oliver. She'd lasted 10 days. Her final dive, port camera at 17 minutes. The shape was there but closer, 40 feet from her submersible. It circled tighter than it ever had during my dives. The footage showed it edging into the floodlight radius, not fully, but enough that she would have seen movement through the viewport. Enough to know something was out there. She'd requested immediate extraction. Left the next morning. I opened files from Felix Parsons. He'd lasted 2 months. His later dives showed the shape at 50 feet, sometimes 45. Closer than my first week, but not as close as Kelsey's final descent. Noah Gordon. 3 months. His footage showed the shape at 60 feet, circling during maintenance windows, vanishing when he adjusted the floodlight angle. Exactly what he'd described in his logs. Shadows at the edge of visibility. Maria Barton. 4 months. Her files showed the shape at 70 feet, farther out, less distinct. It had been more cautious with her, or less interested. I pulled up the size comparison tool in the media player, selected a frame from today's dive where the shape had passed closest, 30 feet from Mantis 7's hull, partially visible in the port camera feed. Drew a reference box around Mantis 7's thruster assembly in the corner of the frame. The assembly was 4 feet across. I knew that from technical specs. Then I drew a second box around the visible portion of the shape. The numbers came back wrong. I recalculated. Same result. The visible section, just the leading edge that had passed through the camera's field of view, measured approximately 40 feet from top to bottom. The thing was curved, which meant the full diameter extended well beyond what the camera had captured. Mantis 7 was 12 feet in diameter at its widest point. This thing was at least 3 times that size, maybe 4, and that was a conservative estimate based on partial visibility. I closed the size tool, opened the forward camera feed from today's dive, and watched the full sequence again. The shape didn't appear in the forward view. It stayed lateral, circling, maintaining position to the side or behind Mantis 7. But when I switched between camera angles, I could track its movement. It didn't drift. Didn't meander. It circled with obvious intention, adjusting its path when I adjusted mine, matching speed when I moved between junctions, holding station when I stopped. I opened the files from my second week, compared them to my 4th week. Today's footage. The pattern was clear, unmistakable. First week. The shape held position at 70 feet. Second week, 65 feet. Third week, 55 feet. Fourth week, 40 feet, sometimes 35. Today, 30 feet. It was closing distance, not randomly, not because of currents or environmental factors. It was edging closer with each dive. Testing, measuring, learning how close it could approach before I reacted. Kelsey had seen it at 40 feet and surfaced immediately. Felix had logged water displacement and lasted 2 months before the pattern became undeniable. Noah had reported shadows and made it 3 months. Maria had worked 4 months, longest of anyone, and the thing had stayed farther out with her. Maybe she hadn't noticed. Maybe it had been more cautious back then. I'd been down there a month and it was already at 30 feet. I sat back, stared at the dark screen. My reflection stared back. Angular features, dark circles under my eyes, pale skin washed out in the terminal's backlight. The thing was learning approach patterns, learning how close it could get before a technician bolted, learning the rhythms of the work, the timing of the dives, the positions where Mantis 7 would be vulnerable during diagnostic sequences. It knew I'd be there, knew when I'd descend, knew where I'd go. And it was getting braver. I left cabin 12 and went straight to the bridge. The vessel rocked beneath my feet. I didn't knock. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside, and Captain Santos looked up from a navigation console where she'd been reviewing something on a mounted screen. The bridge was narrow, maybe 15 feet across, with windows wrapping the forward section and showing gray water under overcast sky. 2 crew members stood at stations along the port side, both wearing headsets, neither turning when I entered. "What am I actually doing here?" I said. Santos straightened. She didn't look surprised. Her expression stayed neutral, military flat, the way it had been since I'd met her 4 weeks ago at the gangway. "You're performing cable maintenance," she said. "As contracted." "No." My hands were shaking. I shoved them into my pockets. The cameras show something following Mantis 7 on every dive, every single one. It's been there since my first descent, and it was there for every technician before me. Gordon documented it. Parsons measured it. Kelsey saw it and left after 10 days. Santos dismissed the 2 crew members with a glance. They removed their headsets, set them on their consoles, and walked past me through the door I'd left open. One of them pulled it closed behind him. The latch clicked. She crossed her arms. "You reviewed the archive footage." "All of it. Mine and the previous technicians. That thing rises from the trench 17 minutes into every descent and stays until we surface. It circles. It watches. It matches our position." I pulled my hands from my pockets. They were still shaking. "You knew. The whole crew knows. Gabriel knew when he offered me the contract." "Yes." Just that. One word, no apology, no explanation. She stood there looking at me with the same expression she'd worn when she'd told me to stow my gear in cabin 12 and attend the briefing. "Why?" My voice came out sharper than I'd intended. "What the hell is Deep Link paying me $400,000 to do?" Santos moved to the navigation console and tapped the screen twice. It went dark. She turned back to me, leaning against the console edge with both hands gripping the metal lip. "The cables are real," she said. "The maintenance work is real. You've been doing exactly what your contract specifies: inspecting junction housings, running diagnostics, logging degradation. That work needs to be done, and you've done it competently. But the maintenance serves a secondary purpose." She said it without hesitation, without lowering her voice or softening her tone. "Deep Link found something in the trench 3 years ago. Something that responds to human presence at specific depths. Your dives keep it occupied, predictable. While you're down there conducting inspections, the creature maintains a consistent position and behavior pattern. That allows our research teams to monitor it from surface vessels without direct interaction." I stared at her. The bridge rocked. I felt the deck tilt beneath my boots and corrected my stance automatically. My throat had gone dry. "I'm bait. You're a maintenance technician, performing necessary work in an area of scientific interest." Her grip on the console edge didn't change. "The creature's presence doesn't interfere with your ability to complete inspections. It maintains distance. It doesn't approach within 30 feet. It doesn't display aggression. It circles closer every time I stay in position. I watched it on the footage. 60 feet, 50, 40, 30. It's testing proximity. And it stops at 30 feet. It's done so for 3 years across 7 technicians and hundreds of dives. We have extensive behavioral data." She pushed off from the console and stood straight, arms still crossed. "The pattern is consistent. It rises at 17 minutes. It stations itself outside your work radius. It observes. When you surface, it descends back into the trench. No deviations, no aggressive displays, no contact." "Gordon reported it," I said. "Parsons measured it. They both documented what they saw, and they both quit before their contracts ended. They terminated voluntarily, as was their right." Santos's voice stayed level, clipped, factual. They were paid for the time they worked. Deep Link didn't prevent their departure or contest their decisions. Kelsey lasted 10 days. She recognized the pattern faster than most. She made an informed choice and left. Santos moved toward the windows, looking out at the gray water. You've lasted 4 weeks. You've completed 28 dives. You've been conducting maintenance work in the creature's presence for a month. And you're still here. Because I didn't know what I was doing. My hands had stopped shaking. They'd gone cold instead, fingers numb. I didn't see it through the viewport. I didn't know it was there until I reviewed the camera footage yesterday. And now you do know. She turned from the windows. You have the same information the other technicians had when they made their decisions. You can complete your contract and earn $400,000, or you can terminate early and take payment for time served. Your choice. The deck tilted again. I heard the bulkhead creak, the same sound I'd heard every night in cabin 12, steady and rhythmic. Why the high salary? I asked. Gabriel said it was hazard pay for isolation, but that's not it. The salary compensates for the risk. Santos walked back to the navigation console, not looking at me. Most technicians recognize the pattern eventually. Some through direct observation, some through log reviews, some through camera footage. Once they recognize it, they understand what they're actually doing down there. The completion bonus accounts for the likelihood that you'll continue working despite that knowledge. Despite knowing I'm being used as bait. Despite knowing the full scope of your role, yes. She met my eyes. The cables need maintenance. The creature needs monitoring. Deep Link requires personnel willing to perform both functions simultaneously. The salary reflects that requirement. I stood there on the rocking bridge with my hands numb and my throat dry, looking at Captain Santos and understanding finally what Gabriel's practiced phrasing and thin smile had meant in that office 4 weeks ago. 7 technicians in 2 years, none completing their contracts, family emergencies and mental health and no specified reasons, all of them voluntary departures, all of them forfeiting the completion bonus. All of them recognizing what I'd just recognized. You're running a tight operation, I said. That's what Gabriel told me. You run a tight operation. I do. No apology, no justification. My crew completes their work safely and efficiently. We maintain the cables. We support the research. We follow protocols. Technicians who want to leave are processed and transported without delay. Technicians who stay are compensated according to their contracts. And if that thing stops maintaining distance, if it breaks the 30-foot pattern, we have extraction protocols. The crane can pull Mantis 7 up in under 3 minutes if needed. You have a direct comm line to the bridge during every dive. We monitor your position constantly. She tapped the dark navigation screen. You're not unsupported down there. You're observed, tracked, and ready for emergency ascent at any moment. I thought about the 17-minute mark, the shape rising from deeper water, from somewhere further down in the trench, ascending to meet Mantis 7 every single time, positioning itself just beyond the floodlights, circling, watching, following me from junction to junction while I ran diagnostics and logged sediment accumulation like the work was routine. What is it? I asked. We don't know. That's what the research is for. Santos pulled a tablet from a charging dock beside the console. It's large, possibly organic. It responds to mechanical activity and human presence at depth. It demonstrates consistent behavioral patterns and apparent intelligence. Beyond that, we're still gathering data. Using technicians as bait. Using technicians to perform necessary maintenance work in an environment where the creature has established territorial interest. She set the tablet down. If you want to terminate your contract, I'll process the paperwork tonight. You'll be off the constant depth within 48 hours with payment for 4 weeks of work. If you want to continue, your next dive is at 600 hours tomorrow morning. Same coordinates, same procedures. She stood there waiting. The bridge rocked. Through the windows I could see gray water and gray sky and nothing else. No shore, no other vessels, just the Pacific stretching out in every direction. 4 weeks of work meant roughly $66,000, enough to cover rent for a year, maybe more, enough to stop the eviction and buy time. $400,000 meant finishing the contract. 5 more months, 140 more dives with that shape circling just outside the floodlights, rising to meet me at 17 minutes, watching through the darkness while I logged cable integrity and pretended the work was routine. I looked at Captain Santos. She looked back, expression flat, military bearing unchanged, waiting for my answer. I left the bridge and went straight to cabin 12. The terminal was still active. Footage paused on the port camera feed showing the shape's curved surface 30 feet from Mantis 7's hull. I sat at the desk. The chair creaked. One more dive, then $400,000, and whatever came after. I closed the paused footage and opened the archive directory. 847 files total. 4 cameras, 2 dives per day, 4 weeks of work, plus the previous technician's recordings still stored in the system. I started pulling files chronologically, beginning with my first dive and working forward. First week, the shape rose at 17 minutes and stationed itself 70 feet out. It circled twice during each dive, wide loops that kept it barely visible at the edge of the floodlight radius. When I surfaced, it descended back into the trench. Second week, 60 feet. 3 circles per dive, tighter loops, longer observation periods where it matched Mantis 7's position and hovered motionless while I ran diagnostics. Third week, 50 feet. 4 circles, close enough that the port camera captured texture details. Mottled gray-black surface, irregular and organic, non-reflective. It began anticipating my movements, positioning itself along my route before I changed course. Fourth week, 40 feet, then 35, then 30. The footage from 2 days ago showed it filling half the port camera frame, massive and deliberate, trailing sediment as it passed. Yesterday's dive brought it to 28 feet during one pass. I backed up the timeline and opened Kelsey's files. She'd lasted 10 days, 20 dives total. Her first dive showed the same 17-minute rise, but the thing stationed itself at 40 feet from the start. By her 5th dive, it was at 30 feet. By her 10th dive, her final descent before she demanded extraction, it circled at 20 feet, and the port camera captured what I hadn't seen in my own footage. An eye. Not human. Not fish. Something else. Large, dark, unblinking, focused directly on the camera lens. I closed Kelsey's files and opened Parsons'. He'd made it 2 months. His early dives showed the same pattern, but slower. The thing had started at 70 feet and worked its way to 40 over 8 weeks. His final dive showed it at 35 feet, circling 4 times, then descending when he surfaced. Gordon's footage went back further. 3 months of dives. The thing had been more cautious with him, or maybe it had still been learning. It started at 80 feet and took 12 weeks to close to 50. His logs documented the shadows and movement, but his camera feeds showed what he'd been seeing. Something massive and patient, learning his patterns, mapping his behavior. I pulled files from the technician before Gordon. Maria Barton, 4 months of work, earliest recordings in the archive. Her first dive showed the shape rising at 22 minutes, not 17. It stationed itself at 90 feet and barely moved. By her 2nd month, it had adjusted to 17 minutes and closed to 80 feet. By her 4th month, just before she terminated for a family emergency that might or might not have been real, it was at 60 feet and circling 3 times per dive. The thing had learned across every technician, adjusted its timing, refined its approach distance, developed the pattern that brought it closer and closer until each person recognized what was happening and ran, and every adjustment carried forward. It didn't reset between technicians. When I started, it already knew to rise at 17 minutes, already knew to station itself outside the work radius, already knew the constant depth and the connection between the submersible and the vessel above. It had been hunting for 3 years. I checked the timestamp on my terminal. 2,200 hours. 8 hours until my final dive. I opened my most recent footage again and watched the shape circle at 30 feet. Watched it move with that same deliberate patience. Watched it track Mantis 7's position with perfect accuracy. I watched another hour of footage. Watched the shape grow closer across weeks of recordings. Passes tightening from 70 feet to 60 to 50 to 40 to 30. Watched it move through the water with that massive, unhurried certainty. Patience wasn't waiting. Patience was knowing the outcome before it happened and taking the time to let it unfold. The thing had been patient for 3 years. One more dive wouldn't change what it had already learned.